Hey guys, FilthyRobot here, bringing another guides, tips, and tricks video. This is a continuation of our Battle Brothers perks videos talking about the various perk builds. Again, the rating system we're using is 1 to 5, 1 being the strongest, 5 being the weakest. And it's kind of a bizarre one that I've chosen for this, but it was a tough decision to make. I'm basically looking at how strong is this perk if it's included in a build that would use it. In other words, if you have a bowman and you take a bow-related perk, how good is this perk for that bowman as a whole, if that makes any sense. So we're going to continue on. We are up to the level 5 perks. Actually, this is 2, 3, 4. This is level 6. It's the fifth row of perks, but it's the level 6 perks. So we're starting with Reach Advantage. Reach Advantage gives you a 20% boost to melee defense for each enemy you hit on your turn. It stacks up to 6 times in a turn. And if you hit multiple attacks with a single attack, it's going to stack multiple times. So if you stab three people with a roundhouse, or whatever it's called, the half swing of a sword, and you hit all 3 of them, you get a 60% melee defense modifier for that turn. If you then Berserk and hit 3 more guys, you're going to have 120% melee defense. All right, I give Reach Advantage a 3. Here's the problem with Reach Advantage. It is to get... all right, when you evaluate this, what you're evaluating against is other forms of defense. So the comparison really becomes Reach Advantage versus Quick Hands, in a sense, because you can always Quick Hand a heater shield. And if you Quick Hands a heater shield, you're pulling out 20 melee defense. That's what you can do with Quick Hands, right? You attack with your 2-handed weapon, you use Quick Hands to get a free item interaction change, and then you pull out a heater shield. So that's your defense compared to Reach Advantage. It gets a little bit more complicated because of things like initiative. You can do your initiative such that at the end of the round you attack and switch to a heater shield. At the beginning of the round, their opponent attacks into your heater shield, so you're fine style stuff, or vice versa, where you can set it up that way. So you can combine it so you have heater shields always out on a 2-handed guy if you have enough initiative, but initiative's variable across different opponents, have different initiative levels, and your initiative changes over the course of the battle, so it's not always perfect. So it becomes a little bit more challenging to make that comparison. But that is the starting point on how I compare Reach Advantage, is how much bonus defense am I getting versus using a shield instead. The second problem with Reach Advantage is it's on hit, not on attack. So the thing with single target attacks compared to multi-attacks in this game is you always are taking an accuracy penalty when you're making a multi-target attack compared to a single target attack for all the weapon systems in the game, which means that you are getting less than you think you might otherwise by looking at your melee attack skills for Reach Advantage. And the third is a lot of the times you aren't making multi-attacks even with weapons that have the ability to make multi-attacks. So a lot of times you are still single-target attacking something, or you don't have the stamina to make a multi-attack, or whatever it happens to be. So the average value that Reach Advantage is returning is a lot less than it might look like on paper. It's not going to be 120% ever. It is rarely going to be more than 40%. And it's often going to be 20%, and sometimes it's when you miss your attack, it's going to be 0%. So that makes it a little bit trickier. What I've found is that I don't much like Reach Advantage. I end up building 2-handers with Reach Advantage because I can't find 2 skills to bring Quick Hands and get initiative up on my other characters, and I use this as kind of a stopgap to make up for that, but it's not a very good stopgap. It is... Almost always with Reach Advantage, I am getting less melee defense back than I am from using a heater shield. This might be a problem with my builds. This is probably something I will continue to work on if and when I play another Battle Brothers campaign, or if I continue to change to skill builds around. I'm still not entirely super happy with my 2-hander build. It works very well, but I could imagine some improvement where I went back to using Quick Hands with shields, because I don't really feel that Reach Advantage is giving me the defense that I feel like it ought to on paper. It's just too many things that tend to negatively impact that along the way. Also, by the way, if you're stunned or otherwise incapacitated, you're not going to get this bonus, or stunned in particular, because you don't get any attacks off. It's another one that sometimes will screw me with Reach Advantage out. So I don't actually think that ability is all that powerful. The thing is, it just happens to be one of the only things that will give you defense on a 2-handed character that you can actually use, because you can't use shields with a two-handed character unless you're using swapping abilities. So if you use a swapping ability, don't use reach advantage. If you aren't using a swapping ability, you pretty much are forced to use reach advantage for some sort of melee defense. It's just nowhere near as much as you might think it would be otherwise. All right, moving on. Overwhelm. I don't like Overwhelm. I already talked about initiative a couple times in this set of guide videos. It's very difficult to get super high initiative without sacrificing things that I consider more important than initiative, and I don't think Overwhelm is all that great as a status effect. You want a lot of these on a target to make it good, and that means you want to attack multiple times around. And what type of weapon has a high initiative and attacks multiple times in a round? Generally bowmen. But bowmen really can't, and bowmen are kind of good with Overwhelm, because with Overwhelm, if you shoot with a bowman and you miss your target, the target you were trying to shoot gets an Overwhelm stack, and the target you actually hit with Scatter also gets an Overwhelm stack, which is nice, but I just find that most of the times it doesn't matter. Not only is the 10% kind of a small debuff value in its entirety, although you can get that higher, of course, with multiple stuff, but a lot of times I'm hitting targets who either aren't attacking or who wouldn't have hit otherwise. I just find that it doesn't have the impact I would like it to have. I just generally feel that I would rather have a damage ability on an archer. I would rather have a damage ability or a stamina ability on a duelist, who's another guy who attacks many times and has a fairly decent initiative. And on a two-hander, I don't care about this whatsoever. And on the guys that only attack once around, like a pikeman, I don't care about this whatsoever either. I want to like it, but all of those problems combined for me make it something that I almost never use. I'd give it a 4. I've seen other players use it and like it, but I have kind of, from an objective standpoint of not being them in their campaign, looked at it and been like, does it really have any sort of impact? It seems to most of the time not. The obvious exception to this is in the early game, where, for example, you are struggling with fallen heroes or something like that, where your characters haven't really fleshed out their builds very much. I could see this being useful, but it's not really an early game perk. So in the early game, you have lesser armor, so your initiative's higher because your armor weighs less. The enemies are more scary, so giving them percent attack reductions is going to be more impactful versus enemies who wouldn't hit your late game guys but do hit your early game guys. I could see this being better, but man, that's pretty late in the skill tree, and it would be a skill I wouldn't want on my finished characters. I don't think very much of Overwhelm. I'd be curious to see if you guys have abilities, builds that really take advantage of this in some way. I mean, there's some obvious synergy between this and daggers, but that seems like such a terrible build, like a dagger Overwhelm build. So, I don't know. Let me know. Let me know if you guys have reasons why this should be better than a 4. All right, moving on. Lone Wolf. Lone Wolf's another weird one. I'm gonna give it a 1, but I'm gonna use it with a caveat that I never use it. So, if I could figure out a build that would use Lone Wolf, this would be an incredible ability. 15% bonus to melee skill, ranged skill, melee defense, ranged defense, and resolve is massive. I talked to you guys about how I like Fortified Mind because the people who are all alone really need that resolve buff. This is giving almost as much of a bonus as Fortified Mind, but it's also giving that same amount of bonus to melee skill and melee defense, or ranged skill defense, or ranged defense, whichever one we want to look at. And the value of your ranged and melee attack tends to be about double the value of your resolve or melee defense, which means the bonus, a percent-based bonus, is going to be giving you twice as many absolute stats. This is just an insane amount of stats that you get from one skill. If I think Gifted is good, and Gifted probably gives you on average 10 stats, 3 for melee defense, 3 for melee attack, 4 for fatigue. If you're getting 10 stat points from Gifted, this is probably giving you, I mean, what's 15% of like 90? You know, you're getting almost 15 melee defense, melee attack from that if you have 90 melee skill. And you're getting, I guess that'd be 14. And I guess you're getting, and like if you have 40 melee defense, which is on the high end, let's say 30 melee defense, you're getting another 5 melee defense from Lone Wolf there. I mean, that alone right there is more stats than Gifted for just 2 of the 5 skills it buffs, which is crazy. That's so many stats. The problem is it's really hard to find builds that actually consistently trigger Lone Wolf without getting themselves killed. It's rare that you want your guys to be 3 tiles away from any of your other guys, and it's rare that you want to spend the time moving them to be in those positions. There's some argument that suggests archers could do it. Certainly if you had an archer who was like here to only kill necromancers, that could be maybe a guy who would use Lone Wolf. But the thing is, my archers are often when I use archers, I use them versus necromancers, I use them versus goblins, I use them versus brigands, I use them versus orc young and orc berserkers. Those are probably the number one fights that I use archers in. And in 3 of those 4 fights, my archers are next to other archers. They're not by themselves. So in 3 out of 4 fights, Lone Wolf isn't going to be a thing that I actually get any benefit from. As melee characters go, the only guy who I use Lone Wolf on is my Geist Hunter. And he is by himself a lot of times, but every other melee character I use is not by themselves. So it's really, really hard to find a scenario in which you get a big bonus you get a reason to be away from your allies and therefore trigger the bonus. The size of the bonus is huge, but it's really hard to find a scenario in which case it's actually going to be a benefit to use that. So if you had a build where your character was alone, this is definitely the perk to pick up because it's so much stats. It's such a good bonus, but shit, is that hard to find. So again, I'd love to hear your Lone Wolf builds. If you got one that works, preferably with video evidence, I would love to see it. Feel free to let me know in the comments section. And if you got a great link to a Lone Wolf build that's not some like day 1000 troll build with like a sword and riposte, but actually as a build that matters in the game when you still haven't like got to the point where you're just cruise controlling it, I'd love to see it because it'd be really cool to build something like that. But I have my doubts. Let's move on to Underdog. I love Underdog. I give this a 1. I take this on pretty much all of my characters who will be in melee. There's just so many scenarios in which you will have 2 to 3 people surrounding you, or sometimes even 3 or 4 people surrounding you, and this then is essentially 10 to 15 buff on melee defense. That defensive malice, which is the opponent's getting +5 accuracy for every guy beyond the first they have around you, is negated by Underdog. My understanding is it only negates the first 3 of those, but I'm not sure. It doesn't say that anywhere in game. It's just somewhere I've read, I think on a wiki somewhere or something like that. But either way, this is consistently 10 to 15 defense on my characters, which I think for a single point is super valuable in the same way that I think 10 attack for a single point is super valuable. 10 defense for a single point is really valuable as well. This is a must-have on any sort of tank character who's deliberately going to be put in front of 3 or 4 enemies at once. Super good. I think very, very highly of this perk point. Moving on, footwork. I don't like footwork very much. I give this a 3 or a 4, probably a 4 realistically. I only use this. I started out using this on 3 different classes. I started out using this on archers, on hybrids, and on my bannermen, and I have now taken it off my hybrids and taken it off my archers, and I only use this on my bannermen now. In part because I use rotation on everybody, pretty much. Well, rotation on all my frontliners anyways. So I don't find it as useful to have footwork. Most of the time what happens if one of my backline gets stuck is I rotate in a frontliner. I don't try to run the backliner away. My problem is my backliners don't have the stamina to spend on footwork. Footwork is as expensive as rotate. It costs you 25 stamina to use, and my backliners don't run stamina recovery abilities because they are chock full of other damage abilities instead, because they often aren't in positions where they need stamina recovery abilities. I don't like it on archers because there's too many things I need to take on archers, and I have just felt this isn't valuable enough most of the time. On the fights where I don't want to be near, where enemies are going to be on top of my archers, namely orc fights where they push through my lines, I tend not to bring a lot of archers versus orcs. I think two-handers are a better counter to orcs in general. So I just don't think it's very useful. I run it on a bannerman because the bannerman will be in a wide variety of fights, including orc fights where you need him for his rally ability, and you will be positions where footwork can actually save that life. And the bannerman has a lot of extra perk points available to him because he's not such a specialized damage dealer that needs all these things. He's mostly there for the morale support that you can afford footwork. But on these other builds, I haven't found the ability to bring that in, especially with the amount of rotate I bring to a fight to protect people otherwise. So I don't think it's worth it personally, except on a very few builds. But I could see if you aren't running rotate on a lot of guys, you can maybe make use of footwork instead. It just feels like of the two, rotate feels like a better ability to me than footwork. In part because the guy, it's a different thing when a guy is stuck in, like, to walk away from that group, in which case they can often just re-engage you, or to put somebody else in that blocker position while rotating yourself out. There's certainly going to be scenarios where footwork saves your life and rotate doesn't, but I find the scenario is often the case where rotate will save my life in a way that footwork wouldn't, or does it just as well, and rotate does lots of other better things for me. I don't like it. right, let's move on. Let's take a look at Berserk. This is like about everyone who's watched. If I had to guess what chat's favorite ability was, I would say Berserk. Everyone wants me to take Berserk on all my builds. I like Berserk. I actually give it a 1. I think it's one of the stronger abilities out there, but I only think it's strong on certain builds. I actually don't like Berserk on my two-handers. I know this is blasphemy for most of you. Don't like Berserk on your two-handers, Filthy. What are you, crazy? I like Berserk on archers, and I like Berserk on duelists, and I like Berserk on back rank pikemen, and I don't like Berserk on two-handers. I think the synergy with 4 action points being returned on a kill is really good with duelists who take 4 action points for an attack, so they can attack and then recover after a kill. I think it's really good on archers who take 4 actions for a shot, so they can shoot 3 times with that. Same with duelists. Duelists can attack 3 times if they don't want to do the kill and recover trick. They can attack 3 times after a kill. And the two-handers can only attack twice if they are stationary. Now, I guess that's true for the duelist as well. I can't Berserk and recover if I'm not stationary for that as well. But the two-handers, I often find it just doesn't really come in as much, especially when, how do I say this? With the two-handers, I can't ever kill and recover because the action points don't work out. Even with Berserk, you go from 9 to 3 and then recover 4 up to 7. You can't ever recover with that. If I am repeatedly multi-attacking with two-handers, like I'm AoEing, I run out of stamina too quickly with Berserk. I can't. At 20, I think it's 23 costs to AoE with a two-hander with the weapon spec, which means that if I'm berserking, I'm burning 46 in a round. And yes, I can use recover to cost myself an entire round, but I don't really want to cost myself an entire round that's only going to give me basically, and it's only going to let me use that ability like twice more again before that I have to recover again style thing. It just feels like, and additionally two-handers, if I have to use recover, I can't get reach advantage defense up, which means that I have no defense for that round. I just don't like Berserk on my two-handers. I haven't found it to be as useful as other abilities, but I really, really like it on archers, and I really, really like it on duelists, and I really, really like it on my pikemen in the back rank, my hybrids. So it's kind of a weird one. It's probably good. It's the only ability to recover action points in the game. It is a damage boost. It's a utility boost in terms of movement and secondary abilities. It's stamina intensive, but if you have some ways to reliably recover stamina, it may not be that bad. I just have a hard time fitting it into my two-hander builds. So, yeah, I'll let you guys do what you want with that. It's certainly a powerful offensive ability, and if you don't have stamina requirements, it's incredible. Like in a very short-term fight, Berserk is really, really good. All right, moving on. Headhunter. I love this ability. I give this a 1. I think I'm one of the few people who uses this consistently that I've seen playing. I'm sure lots of you do as well, but from the group of people that I watch from time to time playing Battle Brothers or talk to about this, I use this on 2 builds. I use this on archers, and I use this on duelist axemen, one-handed axes. Use it on archers because the targets that I'm fighting with archers are almost always goblins or brigand archers. Those are my primary reasons for bringing archers to fights, as well as necromancers and orcs, but these are primarily good versus other archers and goblins. With goblins, it's again about getting it down to a 2-shot kill. If I hit them in the head, it almost always means the next hit will kill them, or if I've already done damage to them, a headshot almost always kills a goblin. And versus the brigands, whose archers A, don't wear a lot of armor in general, and B, don't wear a lot of head armor. Oftentimes a headshot is a kill, or a headshot and a body shot is a kill, where otherwise it might take 3 shots. And again, it's about when you're using your range to kill their ranged, it's very much about keeping ahead of that, making it as action efficient as possible so you can kill them in as few rounds as possible so they get as few attacks as possible out there. It's also really, really nice to have control over a random event. So for example, if your archer has 4 charges of Headhunter, so he's at plus 60%, and his base head attack is 25, he's now sitting at 85% chance to hit head, I might take a shot at a target I wouldn't otherwise, like a sergeant. Sergeants don't wear helms. They're always vulnerable to headshots. If I can now guarantee a headshot, I take what was probably a wasted shot if I didn't have Headhunter and turn this into a very, very high damage attack versus a target that has no armor in that location. And I can remove a target from the field and often get their armor as well, which is really, really nice. So having control over your the RNG that's normally associated with a headshot is really, really nice for me. So I use this on archers for that. On the duelist builds, one-handed axes do additional damage. They do 50% additional damage if they hit head. Not only the crit damage, but this is in addition to the crit damage. They do another 50% damage if they hit head, which makes for some devastating duelists. So I use this on axe duelists as well. I should have some short clips of for you guys on my YouTube in the near future of watching some of the duelists at work. And it always cracks me up watching duelist axemen just crush people with a couple headshots. So I love Headhunter on duelist axemen. All right, moving on, Nimble. I give Nimble a 3. This is probably higher than many of you think, but basically by this criteria, the builds that call for Nimble, how good is Nimble on those builds, and it's decent on the builds that call for it. The thing is, not many builds call for Nimble. Nimble is a bad way of increasing total effective HP if you care about, if you have access to all of the types of armor in the game. What Nimble does is, so 2 things about Nimble. The first is how Nimble works. Nimble gives you when Nimble triggers, it gives you a 50% damage reduction. So, just make sure I'm reading this correctly. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, right, exactly. So what happens if your Nimble procs and an enemy attacks you, the enemy attack does half of its damage to you, which is great. That's an incredible amount of damage reduction. The problem is how Nimble scales. Nimble is a % chance to proc, not a % damage reduction. If Nimble was like, it gave you, imagine that Nimble was 100, what this is, it's a 50% damage reduction. Imagine if it scaled from 50% to 0% damage reduction based on the weight of the armor you were wearing, the weight of the equipment you were wearing. Suddenly that would be reliable. The problem with Nimble is it's so not reliable. Nimble, if you have half of that penalty, so it's 0 to 50, and that includes the weight of your weapon, the weight of your armor, and the weight of anything you're carrying. So you can't have, if you have 50 or more weight on your character, you get 0 Nimble percentage. If you have 25 weight on your character, you're getting half the time Nimble will proc and half the time it won't proc, which as an effective hit point increase is less in general than just wearing better armor. Okay, so why would you ever use Nimble then? If Nimble it's % based, and as effective hit point goes, it's pretty much worse than armor in all levels. I have a graph for that. You can find that on my Reddit, Mr. Statistical. Mine did some cool graphing for us, looked at some numbers for this, and it basically works out as a raw effective hit point multiplier. Nimble's worse than Battleforge, and pretty much worse than just using appropriate level armor at almost every level of armor. There are some exceptions, and the exceptions are on archers mostly. So archers are limited in what they can wear on their head. The most they can wear is a 90 coif, because that is the only way they can keep their eyesight effective. That's so they don't block their eyesight, which means you cannot scale up your armor on your head. So you need some other way of keeping that survivability. The other thing Nimble does nicely is it multiplies hit points as well as armor. Both Battleforged and just increasing armor don't really multiply hit points. They kind of do in the way that armor reduces damage to your hit points, but they kind of don't in the same sense. And Nimble absolutely multiplies hit points as well, making the effective hit points of your health pool, not just your armor pool, larger. I really like Nimble on archers because I can make archers that are running like 60% Nimble or something like that, or sometimes between 50 and 70% Nimble, depending on the gear I get for them, and still having their gear. And what that means for them is that it is % based. I'm not guaranteed to get this protection, but over the course of being hit 3 or 4 times, for example, when I'm fighting goblins on a single archer, Nimble will probably have procced once or twice on average. And that means on average, my character will have taken a fairly decent amount of damage reduction from Nimble. The problem is it's on average. If you get unlucky a couple times with Nimble, it's like you don't have the perk at all. And that's a little bit scary. I don't really recommend it on most builds. I certainly don't recommend frontliners with Nimble, but I did actually find it pretty damn good on archers for one other way to keep their survivability, especially versus headshot stuff. So I now run on my archers, and you guys will see my build sheets, I run Nimble and Steelbrow and Anticipation as my 3 defensive perks on archers. And that has been a pretty damn good set of things for dealing with the fact that their heads are so vulnerable, but their overall HP isn't that important from their body HP. So, yeah. I'll have some fun clips for you as Nimble as well. I do use Nimble on my Lone Wolf Nimble Pathfinder Geist Killer. So you'll get to see that build And I used Nimble there because Geists ignore armor entirely, so having a defensive perk that actually affects the hit points that matter is something useful for that build. But in general, I don't recommend you touch this. Oh, the one other thing I want to talk about Nimble is if you get there's a perk that gives a trait rather that gives your character plus 10 fatigue. For some reason, the way Nimble is coded, if you have that trait, that 10 is 10 more fatigue that you can use that doesn't count against Nimble. So suddenly it's still between 0 and 50, but it's kind of like you start at -10 as opposed to starting at 0. So if you happen to find a hunter, archer class basically with good attack roll, good ranged attack, and who also has, I think it's strong, I think is the name of that trait, that's a really good candidate for Nimble, because he will have additional percentages to proc Nimble, even though he really shouldn't, because of that perk, which is pretty damn cool, because of that trait rather. So yeah, don't really love this ability, but there are scenarios in which it's useful. In general, you're better off just using heavier armor on everybody else, but there are a couple scenarios with that. And also, if you get the cultist armor, I can't remember if it's Davkul or Dakvul, I can't remember which way it's said in this game, but if you do get one of these crazy armor sets that only has like 8 fatigue loss value and has like 300 armor, yeah, go Nimble. Make some ridiculous character if you manage to get that ridiculous armor set. That could be fun. All right, let's talk about Battleforge. Battleforge is a straight 1. This is one of the best abilities in the game. This is the most efficient way to get extra effective hit points on your characters straight up. I do value avoidance slightly more than I value absorbance in this game. But at the same time, Battleforge is just an incredible go-to pick for armor. I run this on all of my frontliners, all of my hybrids, which are backline crossbow / pikeman build, and I run this on my bannerman, because this is it's just an increase in the protection that heavy armor gives you, and I want to put those guys in as heavy armor as I possibly can most of the time anyways. So this is a great way to get more effective hit points. There's no weird shit in this about like how much fatigue how much stamina you have, or how heavy your armor is. This is just the heavier your armor is, the better of a value it is that you get for protection. Use this on guys who can afford to wear bigger helms and bigger armor. If your guy has bad fatigue, Battleforge may not be the greatest of benefits for you, but if your guy has real bad fatigue, you're probably not able to use him in much of anything anyways. Oh, but that does remind me about one more thing I want to say about Nimble. The other thing Nimble does do for you that is not immediately clear from reading the skill is it is a fatigue buff in a way, because a character who can take advantage of Nimble doesn't really have to level fatigue, because they'll have enough fatigue without leveling it because they're wearing such light armor that they can actually trigger Nimble. They probably have enough base fatigue in of itself that they don't have to level fatigue as much. Now, the exception is archers. Archers still have to level fatigue, but if you're finding a build that uses Nimble and isn't an archer, you probably don't have to level as much fatigue, which means you have more stat points to assign elsewhere, potentially health, potentially resolve, potentially initiative, which would kind of be interesting, in addition, of course, to your normal attack and defense skills. I assume Nimble is supposed to be how you can use swordmasters and how you can use retired soldiers. I haven't actually found it makes them usable, but hypothetically it might. So again, something to think about with that. But Battleforge, yep, take it. It's good. There's no more to be said about that. All right, I think I'm going to try to go for these last 4 perks in this video. So let's see if we can finish this up. Let's take a look. Fearsome, I give this a 5. I think this ability is terrible. I've tried it on archers. I have tried it on spear walls. I've tried it with daggers, and I don't like it. I don't like it anywhere. What Fearsome does, normally to trigger a resolve check on an opponent, you need to do 15 points or more of health damage. Fearsome means if you hit them for 1 point of health damage at least, it will trigger a resolve check. This means that really, if you think about it, where is that going to be best? It's going to be best on weapons that don't do a lot of armor piercing damage, so that do a little bit of health damage and attack a lot. That is basically a spear using spear wall. I thought it might be useful with an archer, because the goal was to wreck the enemies as soon as possible to make them as useless as possible, but it's probably actually worse than overwhelm in general for how much it bothers the enemy. And most of the times I would find I would kill them before I would make them break, and even if they did have morale breaks, they would very quickly recover the morale either the turn after or the turn after that, so it really wasn't all that big of a deal. it just wasn't useful on the guys I thought it might be useful on. A lot of my other guys hit for harder than that. Two-handers and pikes are generally going to hit for more than that small amount of damage reduction, a small amount of damage needed. They're going to do more than 15 points of health damage most of the time. And I found for things like orcs, orc warlords and whatnot, made it kind of pointless anyways. Doing resolve damage to them really wasn't all that relevant, as they would very quickly get that back. It just didn't seem to have the impact I wanted it to have. The enemies recovered resolve too easily. It wasn't as much as a disable as I was hoping it would be, and it was harder to apply, or was already being applied without needing fearsome on most of the targets I was using it for. The things that spear walls are best versus are probably zombies. All the undead are immune to morale anyways. It just had no synergy with any of the builds I could figure out going. I can't figure out a way to make this good. It just seems bad to me. Duelist. Duelist is pretty awesome. It is, I give it a 1. It's a defining characteristic of using a duelist fighting character. It is a boost to one-handed damage it's an indirect boost to one-handed damage by giving your one-handed weapons, if you're using a one-handed weapon with no offhand, so no shield or anything else, you get 25% more ignore damage, which means that some of your weapons are between 50 and 55% ignore armor damage, which means they're hitting a lot more health damage. This perk right here is why enemy sergeants are so scary and why enemy swordmasters are so scary, because they do a lot of damage directly to your health, even if you're wearing good armor, and you can take advantage of this too. It's really cool to build duelists. Duelists are a lot of fun. You pretty much want to build axe duelists and cleaver duelists only. Those are the best weapons for it, and axe duelists are probably ahead of the cleaver duelists. But you're really waiting on which legendary weapons you get. You want to build famed duelists if possible, and this is a really, really fun perk to use with that, and it's really, really good when you get it. It's just very situational once you're going to use it. You're never going to use this on anybody else. You want a dedicated build to use this ability efficiently. The opposite of Killing Frenzy. Killing Frenzy is an amazing skill. I give this a 1. 25% damage per increase for 2 turns if you killed something. It's generally pretty easy to keep this going. I run this on archers. I run this on my backliners, my hybrids, and I run this on my duelists, and I run this on my two-handers. And it's just pretty consistent keeping this going on anybody who does any really good damage. And archers will get a ton of kills. Your backliners will get a fair number of kills. Your two-handers will get a ton of kills. Your duelists will get a ton of kills. And this is just a persistent damage buff that keeps going across the game. I find it much more reliable than Berserk in terms of how often I'm getting this bonus, and it's useful, especially on two-handers. I think this is a very strong pickup. It's one of the few direct damage buffs in the game, and it's a really solid one. All right, finally, Indomitable. I give this a 2. I run Indomitable only on one type of unit. I run it on my two-handers because I can fit it on my two-hander build. I can't really fit it on my duelist build. I would run it on my duelist build if I could, even though I hate the stamina cost. Indomitable costs 20, which is a lot of stamina, and it makes you gives you 50% damage reduction, which is great. Don't get me wrong, and but I use it almost entirely for its immunity to being knocked, stunned, or grabbed for 1 turn. And what this means is this is really, really strong. This is actually one of the most important things you can have versus large orc camps that have a mix of orc warriors, orc berserkers, and orc young, because the orc young will stun you just non-stop between their stun charges and their maces. And this is how you deal with that first wave of orcs running into you, so you don't lose turns on all your two-handers as you're setting up. It's also very nice for just being more efficient with tools. I will often use Indomitable in a fight where I don't have to use it, but because the fight is almost won or is almost over, or is at the position where it's so clear I'm just going to crush this fight, I'll use Indomitable as much as I can, even though it drains my stamina super rapidly, just to save in tool cost for the end of that fight. But it's not so great the rest of the time. Basically, you're probably not going to have the stamina to spam Indomitable. You're going to use it a couple times a fight in the same way that you might have used Adrenaline, only in a couple times a fight. And you're not really going to have the stamina to use it every time you might take damage. So maybe you're standing by an Orc Warlord, you might use it once or twice, but then you stam out, especially if you're using AoE attacks. But I don't use it. I use it at the start of the fight primarily to deal with stuns, to avoid being stunned by Orc Young. I like the ability. It's too stamina intensive to use all the time, but it is valuable enough to prevent those first couple rounds of stunning that I do use it fairly consistently. But for me, by the way, is an indirect. There's a couple things else about Indomitable worth talking about. It costs you 3 action points to use, so it's not like Adrenaline. The site, it's not free. which means it synergizes better with weapons that use 6 AP to attack. In other words, it synergizes better with a two-handed weapon than it does with the one-handed weapon, because a two-handed weapon you can attack once, which is your full damage, and still have 3 action points remaining. With a duelist build or a one-handed weapon build, it costs you an attack to use Indomitable, which is super annoying. So there's a little bit of a synergy issue with that. And again, it just feels like the duelists don't have the stamina. For me, the most intensive stamina build that I use is a duelist build, especially because I try to use orc weapons on my duelists when I can, because it just really ups their damage increase, which means they're costing themselves something like, it's like 12 or 13 to swing a weapon. I'm doing that twice a round or sometimes 3 times a round, so I'm doing 26 to 39 stamina per round on those characters, which is a ton of stamina. They don't have any stamina to also pop a 20 stam defense thing that costs them one of their attack skills, whereas if I do it on the front-loaded kind of two-handers where I'm standing waiting for an orc charge, and the orcs charge in and they waste all their stuns on stun-immune characters, and then maybe I do that the first round, kill some guys, and that opens up more range for more orcs to attack me, and I pop Indomitable again. If I use Berserk and attack twice, I'd get stunned, and that means I don't gain any advantage. If I use my regular ability, kill it once, and then Indomitable, I don't get stunned. I use my full action points, and I have used basically less stamina to avoid the stuns and still get as many attacks off style thing. So I really like Indomitable on my two-handers, but I don't really like it on anybody else. I'd probably take it on Duelist just because if I had unlimited perk points, because it can be useful, but I can't really seem to fit it into their build or justify using it instead of attack skills mostly on them. All right, guys, this was a lot of talking. I've done this, for me, this was one sitting, all of these videos all at once, so I feel a little talked out about that. But hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. Hopefully there's been some information there and you've had a sense of my thinking on these. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you guys the actual builds that I put these together, and that will be coming out very, very shortly if it hasn't already by the time this video airs. And you guys can see kind of how I put these builds together and the types of themes that I've used on my characters. But the whole point of these is not that you have to use my builds or take my word for it, but so you get a thought, you get some thinking about these, you get to hear some thoughts about these, and you can put them together in interesting builds for yourselves. And I guarantee, this is the fun part about crowdsourcing, about fun part about being one person with many viewers, is that I'm going to get to hear from you guys about the builds that you've come up with in Battle Brothers. I would love to see them posted. Feel free to post in these threads about some of the cool builds you've encountered, especially if it's something different. If you just have the same generic two-hander that everybody else has, yeah, okay, I mean, it's cool, you want to share that. But if you found something that you use that really helps you out, that's totally different than all of these other players who are playing the game, I would love to hear that. That stuff to me is super cool to find out about. If you use Pathfinder all the time with some crazy build, that's awesome. I want to hear about it. If you have awesome Nimble builds out there that are great, or fearsome builds out there that are great, or you have your whole team running Overwhelm with some sort of initiative build that I don't use, I'd love to hear these things, guys. So please feel free to post in the comment sections builds that you're using, and to chat with each other and myself about the builds that you're using, because I'd love to hear that. Anyways, guys, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this has been enjoyable, and I'll see you soon.